Must be a theme. Hello, I'm Chris Irons. I'm from Strata Solve. I'm also former Commissioner of Body Corporate and Community Management. With me, as always, Frank Higginson, partner, Hines Legal Strata expert. Frank, welcome.
Hello, Chris. Hello, everyone. Again, day
Now,
after Australia Day.
indeed, yes, so we're all refreshed. Fingers crossed that we are tech issue free this week. Those of you who are regular viewers, and I know you all are, know that we had some fun and games last week. We have done a thorough tech audit and we feel we're back on track today. Time will tell, won't it? Please be patient. But no, we should all be right. As always, we very happy, aren't we, Frank, to answer as many questions live as we can. But if you have a bit of a complicated one or a longer one or something slightly off topic, you're better off using the form link that has appeared in the comments now, and you can fill in your details there and someone will get back to you. Today, Frank, the year ahead in Strata. So what's the point of doing this?
It's an interesting one. You know, like it's all, what is it with forecasters? Forecast early, forecast often, and then never go back and revisit it. So, but this, I think, is a little bit different in the context of we are in the middle of a statutory reform process. So it's all well and good usually for us to sit here and say what should happen. But as we sit, the Strata law reform work is still ongoing. There's lots of moving parts. We've definitely seen things appear in those groups that probably weren't originally on the agenda for whatever reason that may be. So I think for a change, once we sit here and talk about what could or should or might happen, if you actually want to get involved in doing something, there's never been a better opportunity to put your best foot forward and ask the question, because the government has said, we're reforming strata laws, you know?
Things are, Strata's got a bit of profile just at the moment. I think there's a combination of things have led us to this point. And so that's why it's important for us to sort of, as the Strata experts in the sector, to sort of project what we think is going to happen this year, to sort of give some structure to all of that. We're actually keen to hear what you think will happen in 2022 in Strata, or indeed what you would like to see happen in 2022 in Strata. Let us know in the comments, and towards the end we'll have a look at some of those and see if we agree or disagree, as the case may be. Let's rip right into it then, Frank. So the big one, and we won't labour the point on this one too much because we did it last week, was the smoking issue and the hazards issue. So Frank, 2022 looks like it might be the year of hazards in Strata.
It's going to be. It absolutely from left field. So even the question, well, we had a lot of feedback off last week's webinar from lots of people, obviously, which is fine and good. Glad that people are engaging. I think the question I'm getting asked the most is, when does the appeal or the right to appeal that expire? And it's really next week, because as much as we only did the webinar last week, the decision was handed down on the 21st of December. So 6 weeks to appeal that, and it'll be all over. So if it's not, then that's going to become, well, I suppose, the position of the Commissioner's office with respect to hazards, particularly on smoking. And then the question, I think, you know, I suppose we're going to steal too much thunder of a future webinar. What else is a hazard?
Not only that, Frank, where does the committee's role and responsibility kick in relation to these things, which is, as you say, we're going to cover that in a separate webinar coming up. But I think the ramifications out of that decision that we spent a bit of time talking about last week are going to be felt this year in Strata in Queensland. And I think if you're on the committee, or indeed if you're a manager, Strata manager, I think you're now on notice about the need to, how do we put it, Frank, exercise a bit more oversight?
Yeah, certainly not put your hands in the air and just, or wash your hands of the particular problem. And actually, I'm quoting today's Fin Review. Forgot to tell you that. Talk about property prices and that sort of stuff.
Nice piece, Frank.
But one of the things that we're going to and fro with the journo with beforehand, which didn't make it into the article, but it's interesting sort of thing, that law of unintended consequences. So what else is coming? Because when you come back to that, lacrosse in Victoria, so the fire that really started all of the aluminium cladding stuff, that was a cigarette in a plastic bucket on a balcony that caught fire. Fire went up and down, and all the polyethylene and all that sort of stuff went with it. When you look at the ability of a body corporate to prevent people smoking on balconies, which this decision basically almost expressly allows, and you look at the position of insurers with respect to fire risk, and then you add aluminium composite paneling to buildings. And so the way in Queensland, I suppose, evidently there's some buildings that have removed it. There's probably lots more that fire engineers are saying you don't have to worry about removing it. So when you put that in front of an insurer and say, well, a body corporate can now lawfully prevent people from smoking on balconies, and we've got a building that has this on it that we're required to insure, or the body corporate seeking insurance for, I'm wondering whether it's going to be a condition of insurers to start preventing people from smoking on balconies when bodies corporates can legally do that, particularly where that building might be more at risk. It's certainly one way to remove risk or lower risk from an insurance perspective. Yep. So that's those sort of things. The decision's a week old. Absolutely haven't seen any of that sort of stuff yet. Is that coming? But it might.
As we say, stay tuned for an in-depth webinar on hazards and committee responsibilities therein coming up pretty soon, but we think that's going to be a huge issue this year, obviously. Next on the list of Strata issues in 2022, sorry, I'm going to say it, I'm going to say the C word. No, not cocktails. COVID. Sorry, but we had to say it. It's still here, and for Strata, it's still a big deal. So I know, Frank, you and I have talked about this a couple of times lately, independent of the webinars. I know I've certainly had a few questions posed to me about how both committee meetings and general meetings should be run at the moment. And when we say at the moment, we say at the moment in the context of there's literally tens of thousands of COVID cases per day. The reality, though, Frank, is that there are no rules, there are no health directives which enable a body corporate to do as they please at the moment.
No. So we've still, the COVID regulations are still sitting there until the end of April. So a few of the things in that still apply is bodies corporates can't be charging interest on overdue levies during this period. Bodies corporates also can't be commencing proceedings for overdue levies during the COVID period. The other thing is bodies corporates with respect to meetings and common facilities can't be changing, I suppose, the statutory regime for meetings and accessing those things unless there is a health directive. So certainly I think we both copped the questions now. I suppose we're going through January's AGMs, being the end of January, about, well, can we shut this meeting down? Can we prevent people from coming? Can we do this? Can we do that? And at the moment, with the let it rip mentality from a COVID perspective, there's no health regulations preventing bodies corporates from or directing people not to do meetings the normal way they would. So we've got a whole bunch of people that inevitably are probably doing electronic only meetings, without a proper approval and cancelling things and not letting people come and visit them and all sorts of stuff. When at the moment, there's no law that says that you can do that.
It's not that, there seems to be this impression, Frank, that there's carte blanche at the moment because there's an awful lot of COVID cases that when it comes to Strata meetings and Strata processes, there's carte blanche. No, there's not. And in fact, this is a really good reminder that if body corporate is going to conduct its general meetings electronically, it needs to resolve that by ordinary resolution first. There is no kind of catch-all provision that enables that to happen. So, and as Frank, you pointed out, those provisions are now in place until the end of April at this stage. I think you'd be a very brave person to suggest that's the end of it at the end of April. I would think it gets extended. So the reality is that those provisions which expressly link the modification of meeting processes to health directives, I think are going to be in place a bit longer yet. So the onus is back upon committees and Strata managers again to make sure they're doing the right thing and make sure, as you say, Frank, voters are not disenfranchised.
And that's the big thing, isn't it? So bodies corporates Yeah, and I suppose, so that's in a legal vacuum, that's the position. Absolutely, there's no right to do away with normal meeting procedures. In a practical sense, inevitably, there's a whole lot of people that are doing it, and you can't see adjudicators getting too stroppy with it, provided that people are still given the ability to have their say. So, if you go and kill a meeting specifically to sort of stifle debate on an issue or prevent someone from voting, or because they've told you they can only do it this particular way, then that may be a world of pain
Yep.
from an adjudication perspective. But if everyone still has the chance to have their say, there's definitely got to be an argument to say, well, it really didn't matter anyway, which is, you can have all these technical arguments about all sorts of things and go back to that district court decision where a district court judge said this legislation is impossible to completely comply with. So, you've got to look at technical non-compliance versus compliance or non-compliance that causes someone to not be able to do what they should be able to do. And I think that's the interesting thing.
I think so too, Frank. And I think, so what does that mean for the year ahead? I think government's going to have to turn its mind to whether or not it makes permanent some of these temporary laws that have been in place for a couple of years, or whether it creates new legislation which covers this kind of situation much more generally into the future, effectively making it carte blanche. That will be an interesting discussion, that one, and I think that will come up in the not too distant future. And I think the perennial issues around the use of swimming pools, gyms, spas, access to common property, people who are vaccinated, people who are unvaccinated, closing, opening, I suspect that they're not going away, those questions, and we might have to see a situation where there's clarity around that in the near future. Let's talk about the property market in 2022 and how it relates to Strata, Frank. So we're hearing that the market is hot when it comes to rents, when it comes to sales. Maybe not so much in the inner city in Brisbane, maybe. What are you hearing, Frank, for 2022?
Well, as long as interest rates remain low, everyone has the ability to borrow as much as they like. So I don't know. It's and I suppose for those of you that haven't met me personally and had one of my doomsaying lectures, I just actually a really interesting anecdote. So I've had a really experienced property client on the Gold Coast who's been through stuff down there since the early 80s. So he's actually not a property client as much as he's chairperson of a body corporate. So I talk to him fairly regularly because there's a bit of stuff going on. And I said to him the other day, have you ever seen it this silly? And he said, yep, Japanese investment boom in the late 80s. Made the GFC, that made the GFC look tame. And he said, this is bigger than that in terms of the level of activity and all that sort of stuff. So I don't know, I'm no economist, but you look at it, what I'm getting at the moment is a whole lot of tension and urgency and pressure from everyone. It's really extraordinary how quickly sort of people expect things to happen or want things to happen, not expect's the wrong word.
Yeah.
They want this deal done, they want that. And the difficulty being in the transactional element of it where I am is sometimes the detail at that particular pointy end of the conversation is really important to get right. And this is both bodies corporates trying to close out contracts for projects. It's certainly in management rights trying to get particular things done by certain dates, body corporate approvals and the rest of it. And it's really easy to overlook something in the rush. So I said to a client the other day in relation to a deal that was announced to the share market today. So there you go, twice in the, not that my name's on the share market thing, we're selling where the pressure is really on, and the vendors, so the buyers ringing my client's ringing me, and stuff flying around everywhere. And I said, mate, this is the time where one of us is going to make a mistake because we're trying to do something really quickly and we only realise it in 2 months' time, and then we look at it and go, how on earth did that happen? And how on earth it happens is you're rushing.
And so that goes, Frank, for also strata managers and committees, I would venture. If you've got a committee that is being bombarded, or manager that's being bombarded with requests for information certificates, for example, record searches, because there is really tight timeframes on settlement because of demand, then that also creates an issue. But I think the other thing to recognise here for 2022, we're talking about all of this property market transaction, that means a high turnover of people involved in strata, doesn't it? So new owners, unsophisticated owners, new tenants, new occupiers, all of those people, yeah, new committees. All of those people have needs, strata needs, in one way or another. They'll have a need for information, they'll have a need for education, and more than likely they'll have a need for a dispute to be resolved. Someone's going to have to do that somewhere, aren't they?
And that is the interesting thing. Like these, we're almost 2 years into these webinars now. You know, we've got, you say tens of hours. I don't know what the right descriptor is for that, but whether it's 70, 80 hours worth of webinar content that we've done over the last couple of years. Probably a couple of people have watched them all and some people have watched some, but there's a whole platform there which is still the content that people new to Strata need, and they don't know it's actually there until they go hunting, and then they can spend so much time looking for it, because that's the difficulty with the Strata market, is the education piece of it, because it's complicated. That's what we talk about all the time. And the other thing with property this year that will be even more interesting is the federal elections due by May. So, and it is extraordinary, although it didn't happen at the last state election. That's probably because it was a foregone conclusion that Anastasia was going to romp in. But the uncertainty about a change in government stops people making business decisions. So normally what happens when an election's called, and it could go either way, is that people stop. So if we've got a 4-week campaign, phone slows down, activity slows down, and then the day after the election, no matter which way it goes, people start doing things again, because it's not like, you know, regardless of which government comes in, you're still going to do the things you're going to do usually. So that will be in the middle of a year that might slow things down. Suppose you add a rate rise or two to that at the same time, and it could be really interesting.
It could be. Frank, what's happening with management rights in 2022, do you reckon?
At the moment, in the southeast corner, it is really hectic in terms of transactional activity, and probably doing few different things for some clients. Like even one client just before, he's been in his management rights for 8 years, and he's come to an agreement with the committee where they're going to completely disband it, where he's going to keep the unit, so going to get rid of that, or he can keep that separately. They're going to create a separate caretaking only contract that's not tied to a management rights, and he's going to separate the letting and put that elsewhere. But that's all in concert with the committee. They've decided this is what collectively we want to do, and then they're willing to allow that to scatter. So owner of unit, owner of letting rights, owner of caretaking can all be different things, which is unusual. So, but in terms of pure transactional activity, over the break it was a little bit quiet, but we came back on the 4th of January. It hasn't stopped since. So, I mean, it's better than not being busy. But there's sometimes it wouldn't be a bad thing to slow down a fraction.
No. And so the message there is that transactionally in management rights, it remains like a huge moving feast in 2022. We'll see lots of different ways of thinking or different ways of looking at the transaction. Everybody wants to maximize what's in it for them, of course. We'll see much more of that. And it goes back to the point we made just a couple of minutes ago, that as there are more transactions in that space, there'll be more entrants into that market. Those people will also need to get up to speed as well. So that is going to be a big issue this year. We're getting a few comments coming through about what people are thinking for 2022. Keep them coming, everyone. We'll get to those towards the end today. But our next 2022 issue, insurance, is going to be a big deal this year. Why is that, Frank? You just talked about federal election. This is actually probably for the first time that I can recall where Strata gets to be a federal election issue.
Absolutely. And I did a really interesting bunch of seminars late last year. Yeah, I forget which day of the week it is, let alone which year. And at those, regardless of what you might think of them personally, George Christensen and Warren Etch came along and presented in relation to what the federal government was doing about insurance. And so, to be fair to both of them, they were clearly across the detail, as much as there's the usual political weasel words and keeps it very high level. But in essence, the intent with the federal reinsurance scheme is to, because insurers price risk, and risk for cyclone and risk for floods in North Queensland has proved to be a risky business. So the intention behind the reinsurance pool is to effectively say to insurers, you're not going to have to reinsure, because if Suncorp charges you $1,000, they're not bearing all that risk. They'll usually go and pay another big reinsurer, like a Warren Buffett's General Ray or whatever, behind the scenes, $600 of that $1,000 to assume some of the risk. And so what the federal government's saying is, we will assume the risk for the cyclone and for the flooding, and you won't need to go offshore to find that. And the intent is that then that those buildings, the 20-unit building in Northern Beaches of Cairns, should cost near enough to the same to insure the 20-unit building at St Lucia.
That's
now,
the
whether
theory
that
anyway,
happens
Frank,
is going to be a really interesting thing.
And why is that a big deal? Well, because in the federal election, seats in North Queensland are going to be among the most contested in the country. That's where many commentators feel that the election might be won or lost. And so on the one hand, you've got the government putting out this policy position to address insurance affordability and availability, and not forgetting that when we talk about NQ insurance, we're talking about pretty much anything north of Bundaberg these days. That's North Queensland for you. So that's that. On the flip side, Labor is also in that discussion and in that space, looking at what it is going to put forward to address those issues, because they want to be seen as pitching in those North Queensland seats. So that's one aspect to insurance. The other aspect to insurance, and I think the bit of a sleeper this year, is everyone gets focused on North Queensland because of the natural disasters which occur there. But in the southeast corner, Frank, and we've seen it several times, haven't we? You've got buildings that are struggling to insure or get cover or get renewed because they haven't done maintenance, or they haven't informed the insurer about improvements.
Yes, improvements, particularly around fire safety and those sort of things. So it's, I don't know, they talk about insurance being a hard market at the moment. It's not as easy to get insurance, and the premiums are going up as a result of it. And, my house insurance rolled through the other day and it went up 15% without a claim. And it's like, far out, so I think you apply that across the board. So even a relatively safe place like Brisbane, in that sense, it's going to be incredibly interesting. But bodies corporates particularly, and even now, I'm just thinking we've given a couple of advices already this year about insurers that have come back and said, no, not going to do that. We don't want to insure for that. You need to fix that before we're going to give you insurance. So we'll give you an extension for 2 months while you go and do that. And of course, it's not realistic to do that when you can't get hold of tradies. And particularly, you've got a high rise that requires scaffolding and all those sorts of things. So the insurers are definitely getting a bit more picky about who they insure and at what price they do it. And sometimes it would seem there's not even a function of price. It's just no.
And so what that means for Strata will be that if you have got a maintenance job on your agenda to vote for, like a work quote to vote on, and for whatever reason the body corporate votes no, simply because they think it's too much money, well and good. The consequence of that can be catastrophic in this case for 2022 if that's how the trend continues. If your body corporate declines a quote or some works, the consequence could be that you're not insured, or that you will be paying through the nose for it thereafter. So I think that's going to be, and it comes back again, I think the mantra that we're hearing more and more in this discussion, Frank, isn't it? The responsibility on committees and strata managers to ensure that they're properly executing their responsibilities under legislation.
It's a voluntary role from a committee perspective, but even again, that Artiq decision sort of gave the committee a little bit of a slap in circumstances where previous decisions that wouldn't have even been commented on. So maybe there's a degree of frustration in the Commissioner's office with the fact that some of these disputes are coming there that shouldn't be coming there. So you put your hand up to get involved. So get involved.
Absolutely.
One way to frame that.
Our final kind of our projection for 2022, and I think this is a bit of a sleeper, but will emerge this year, is what we would call bullying. And this gets brought up all the time, of course. But I think what we're hearing and seeing now, Frank, aren't we, is where it relates to contractors. So caretakers and body corporate managers are feeling as though, or not feeling, but experiencing situations where they are under siege from the actions of individuals, be they owners, occupiers, committees, other contractors for that matter. I think it's going to be a huge issue because the pressure is on government to step in and offer some relief here. It's a difficult one to do much about, isn't it?
Yeah, it's all about feelings. It's not black and white. It's not numbers, but it's still, and this isn't targeting any particular group, because there's lots of snarky emails that go. Still, some of the things that arrive on my desk, to the extent that I print them, but across my screen, you look at what people say to other people in writing, and it's just appalling. So I think the best little bit of advice to give every first-year lawyer starting here is you've got to write every bit of correspondence as if a judge is looking at it in 3 years' time. And if you do that, usually it's professional, it's tempered, it's unemotional, and it's factual. And I suppose we both get it, mate, in terms of how frustrated people get with where they are. But and I suppose, you come back to that tension and urgency and all that sort of stuff, that leads to potentially a bit more snarkiness. But some of the things that we see are, in a sense, almost unforgivable, but even worse, are probably actionable, particularly in that defamatory element.
And look, I still think there remains an option under body corporate legislation to widen the scope of what currently is dealt with, to incorporate those contractors. To
there you go.
Yep. No.
Well, no. I've got a random left field without notice. Could a hazard be a hazard to someone's mental health?
Yeah, absolutely, it could. I think so. Would be a bit trickier, I think, to objectively show, but it absolutely could be, Frank. Absolutely. So I think that is definitely on the agenda this year. I'd be interesting to see how government tries and responds to that, because I think the ball's back in government's court on so many of these issues at the moment. Frank, we might quickly run to some of the comments. Yes. Craig, thanks for looking. Craig, reform needs to include accountability for body corporate managers who, in my experience, side with the committee who employ them over the owners, stakeholders, conflicting interests. Fair enough, Craig. Reform for body corporate managers is absolutely on the agenda. I guess my question to you, my question to anybody who says that, is what does reform look like, and are you prepared to pay for it? Frank?
Agree. So I think, and the unfortunate reality of the situation is the committee is going to dance to the tune of who pays them. And I know you're going to say, well, all of the owners pay them, but they're reporting to the committee. The committee is their single most usually important source of reappointment. So they are inevitably going to act on the committee's instructions, potentially the detrimental against individual owners. So expecting them not to do that, I think is a little bit optimistic. But by the same token, regulation in some form that actually creates, I suppose, binding duties, more clarity around whose obligations are to who, and all those sort of things, which is absolutely coming for strata managers. That's well and truly on the reform agenda. Don't know about the timing of it though, Chris. I suppose it's sort of still gradually trundling away. But the SCA, the peak industry body, has called for it.
Yep.
So degree of professionalism that will appear that stops Higginson strata management starting up tomorrow.
Such as it is. Very quickly to the rest, Neil, thanks for tuning in. Neil's got a comment about smoking. Does that also include meat smokers from the balcony next door? Could very well do, Neil.
If it's hazardous.
Yep. In that particular, or just to clarify, in that particular order, it was tobacco products. That was the specification, but it could very well be expanded to include that. Mandy, a couple of comments there about smoking. Some of the short-term holiday makers smoke on the balconies and the on-site manager turns a blind eye. just a point to remember there, Mandy, it's not the responsibility of the on-site manager to enforce bylaws. They are not the body corporate police. But take your point. Nonetheless, Julia, thank you always for tuning in. Julia, do you reckon the year and a half it takes to get a ruling from BCCM is likely to get longer or shorter? Probably longer, Julia. Yep. Frank?
Yep.
Probably.
Unless just some more resources tossed into that department. The workload's not going down.
Or Chapter 6 is changed to restrict what can go in there. And Julia, further comment about the number of emails that you've received. Yep, that's not good. And Kieran, finally, thank you for tuning in. Property managers need to expand their skills to include some basic knowledge of construction, significant maintenance and project management. Quite possibly.
Well, Frank? With Strata managers being registered, there's going to be some requirement for CPD, isn't there?
Yep.
Registered, qualified, licensed, I suppose, whatever you want to use. Normally, the same as we do, 10 hours of CPD a year you got to do, that same sort of thing. So inevitably, you'd like to think that the obligation to learn might help with some of that.
There will be a benchmark. If managers are going to be regulated, there will have to be a benchmark for what constitutes appropriate management. Far out. We've come to the end, Frank. That was quick. So I think the key takeaway for this year, there is a lot happening in Strata in 2022. There will be a lot happening. And I think expect the unexpected. You've got to be prepared to react reasonably quickly in this space, don't you, Frank?
Well, we started that with last week's webinar, didn't we? That's from left field.
Did that one
law since 1997, so there you go.
There you have it. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Great interaction, great participation, as always. Really appreciate it. Next week, Frank, I think we are talking
administration.
Administration.
And not administration in the sense of what a body corporate manager does, but the age-old, this body corporate is dysfunctional. Someone else needs to make the decisions for it.
That will be a good one. That topic comes up a lot, but we're going to try and actually define what that means. So stay tuned for that one next week. In the interim, thank you very much, everyone. As always, appreciated. There's a lot else going on in the world, so thank you for taking the time. Frank?
Great. Thanks, everyone. See you, Chris.
See you all. Bye-bye. Bye.